I can still feel it, the silence in that room, pressing down on me like a heavy, suffocating weight. The sterile white walls, the beeping machines, the faint, almost dim light filtering in through the half-drawn curtains, it all felt so hollow, so unforgiving. And there I was, lying in that cold, uninviting hospital bed, my newborn daughter bundled up in my arms, her tiny breaths the only warmth I had in those lonely hours. I had imagined this moment so many times, the moment I would hold my child for the first time. I dreamt of how we would be surrounded by family, by love. I thought he'd be there beside me, my husband, holding my hand, smiling at me, telling me how proud he was. But that was just a dream, a fantasy I'd built up in my mind. The reality was far from that dream. The reality was that I was alone. He wasn't there, and I wasn't sure he ever truly was. Even as I struggled to breathe, weakened and worn down from hours of labor, I clung to my daughter, desperate to hold on to this single, pure moment that was just mine. She was all I had in that room, the only one who belonged to me entirely. And as I looked into her small, innocent eyes, I felt a mixture of fierce love and heartbreaking sadness. She deserved more than this. More than a father who had left us alone at the most vulnerable moment of our lives. The nurses came in occasionally, giving me sympathetic glances, offering small reassurances that he'd come, that maybe he was just delayed. But I knew better. I knew exactly where he was. He was out celebrating. With her. The words burned in my mind. He's with her. I'd overheard him talking to his friends about a party. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. He was out with his ex, laughing, drinking, living as though his world hadn't just changed forever. As though his own child hadn't just taken her first breaths alone, without him. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the ache in my chest, the betrayal that felt like a knife twisting inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask him how he could do this to us. But even in my broken state, I knew the answer. He had always chosen her. Even when he promised he'd left her behind, a part of him was still with her. And now, in the moment that should have been ours, he was with her again, and so I lay there, my body weak but my heart somehow still beating, holding my daughter close. I whispered to her, a promise made in the quiet of that lonely room, I'll be here for you. I won't leave you. I'll be the one who stays. But as the hours passed, and I drifted in and out of sleep, I felt something strange. A coldness creeping in, a feeling that I couldn't shake. And with each shallow breath, I began to wonder if I'd even get the chance to fulfill that promise. They say love is about compromise, about sacrifice, about standing by each other through thick and thin. And I believed that, wholeheartedly. In the beginning, our love was beautiful. Or at least, I thought it was. He was charming, attentive, promising me the world, and a future that seemed like it was plucked right out of a fairy tale. But now, as I look back, I see how carefully he painted that illusion. I see the cracks that were there all along, the little moments where he'd pull back, as if holding himself back from me. And yet, I ignored it all, because I wanted to believe that love could fix everything. I wanted to believe in him, in us. I remember our first year of marriage, how I had to learn to make space for his past, for her. She was his high school sweetheart, a part of his life long before I came into the picture. And even though he swore that she was in his past, I could feel her shadow lingering over us, like a silent third person in our marriage. Every time her name came up, he'd get this look, a softness, a nostalgia that made me feel like I was competing with a memory I could never match. There were times he'd run into her at gatherings or reunions, and he'd assure me it was just friendly, nothing more. But the way he looked at her, it was different. I'd confront him, ask him if he still had feelings for her, and he'd brush it off, saying I was being paranoid. I'd feel guilty, ashamed even, for doubting him. So I learned to keep quiet, to swallow my insecurities, to let him have that part of his life without questioning it. After all, who was I to compete with his past? But it wasn't just her. Over time, I began to see how little space there was for me in his life. He was always busy, always working late, always finding reasons to be somewhere else. I remember one night, sitting alone in our apartment, waiting for him to come home. I'd cooked his favorite meal, set the table with candles, hoping to surprise him after a long week. Hours passed, and he didn't come. He didn't even call. When he finally walked in, well past midnight, he looked surprised to see me waiting. He said he'd been out with friends, that he'd lost track of time. I didn't have the strength to argue, to tell him how that night, sitting there alone, I'd felt more like a stranger in my own marriage than a wife. So I let it go, like I'd let so many things go before. And then there were the sacrifices. The little pieces of myself I chipped away, thinking it would make him love me more. I'd always dreamed of pursuing my art, of building a career that was my own, but he wanted stability, security. He'd tell me, art's a nice hobby, but it doesn't pay the bills. And so I let that dream slip away, telling myself that our marriage was worth the sacrifice, that we were building a life together. I stopped painting, stopped dreaming, stopped talking about the things that lit a fire in my soul. And as I faded into the background, I watched him live his life freely, untouched by the sacrifices I'd made. He chased his ambitions, his friendships, his past, while I quietly stood by, waiting for him to see me. Then came the time when I found out I was pregnant. For a moment, I thought things would change. I thought he'd finally understand what it meant to have someone depend on him, to be needed. But even then, his reaction was distant. He was happy, sure, but not in the way I'd expected. He talked about how we'd need to be more practical, about the financial responsibilities, about the changes we'd need to make. Not once did he ask me how I felt, how the pregnancy was affecting me, how I was holding up. It was as if he'd already distanced himself from the experience, as if it were just another responsibility to manage. Throughout the pregnancy, I tried to tell myself that things would be different once the baby arrived, that he'd step up, that he'd finally become the partner I needed. But as the months passed, his indifference only grew. He'd leave me alone at appointments, cancel last minute, always with an excuse that seemed reasonable enough to forgive. I'd sit in those waiting rooms, surrounded by couples holding hands, laughing, planning their futures together, and I'd feel this hollow ache in my chest, wondering why I felt so alone with the person who was supposed to be my closest ally. And yet, I stayed. I convinced myself that I was overthinking, that maybe I was just being too needy, too emotional. I didn't want to be the nagging wife, the one who demanded more than he could give. So I learned to carry the weight on my own, to put on a brave face, to make excuses for him, even when I knew deep down that he was choosing everything and everyone else over me. I remember one night, about a month before I went into labor. I was lying in bed, struggling with the weight of my belly, the constant ache in my back, and the anxiety that kept me awake. He was supposed to be home, supposed to be there for me, but instead he'd gone out with his friends, celebrating some trivial occasion, leaving me to lie there alone, clutching my belly, whispering to my unborn child that I would always be there, even if no one else was. In that moment, a part of me broke. I realized that I'd been holding on to a hope that he'd never live up to, that he'd never become the person I needed him to be. And yet, I stayed, because leaving felt like an admission of failure, a betrayal of the promises we'd made. I stayed because I still loved him, even if he didn't love me in the way I needed. As the due date approached, I tried to hold on to a shred of hope. I wanted so badly to believe that, when the time came, he'd realize what mattered, that he'd set everything aside and be there for me, for our child. I clung to that belief, convincing myself that he just needed time to adjust, that the weight of becoming a father would sink in eventually. After all, this was our family, our future, wasn't it? But as my belly grew, so did the distance between us. It was like he couldn't bear to see the life we were creating together, couldn't bear the responsibility, the commitment, the reality of it all. I'd watch him get ready to go out, fixing his hair, pulling on his jacket, all while I sat there in silence, watching him walk out the door night after night, leaving me alone with the whispers of my own fears. There were nights when I'd ask him to stay, telling him I wasn't feeling well, that I needed him. And each time, he'd give me a dismissive excuse. "I'll just be an hour," he'd say, as if that hour didn't stretch into the early morning. He'd roll his eyes when I looked disappointed, accusing me of being clingy or overly emotional. And each time he left, the loneliness grew heavier, settling into my bones, whispering that I was no longer enough for him. One night, I was lying in bed, exhausted and aching, when I heard my phone buzz. I glanced at the screen, hoping it was him, maybe telling me he was on his way home. But instead, it was a picture. A photo of him, laughing and smiling, his arms slung around her shoulders. The two of them standing together, looking as carefree as they had in their high school days. It was from one of his friends, someone who didn't realize what that photo would do to me, how it would shatter the fragile hope I'd been holding on to. I remember just staring at that image, my mind numb, unable to process what I was seeing. There he was, out with his ex, while I lay alone in our bed, heavy with the weight of his child, exhausted from carrying this life we'd created together. And in that moment, a part of me broke. I could feel it, a crack running deep through my heart, as if something essential had been torn away, something I'd never get back. I confronted him when he came home, too late to even pretend he'd only been gone an hour. He walked in, smelling of alcohol and laughter, a carefree smile on his face, oblivious to the weight of his choices. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just asked him, with a voice barely above a whisper, why he would choose her over me, over our child. He looked at me, as if my question was ridiculous, as if I was being irrational, and said, "It's not like that. We're just friends. Why do you always make a big deal out of nothing?" Those words hit me harder than any argument, any accusation. It was as if my pain, my loneliness, my sacrifices all meant nothing to him. I wanted to tell him how much it hurt, how much it destroyed me to see him with her, to be left alone time and time again. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. He wouldn't hear me. He'd never heard me. In the days leading up to the birth, I tried to bury the pain, to focus on the life growing inside me, the life that would soon be my whole world. I wanted to believe that once our child arrived, things would change, that he'd look into her eyes and understand, that he'd feel what I felt, that he'd finally come home to us. But that hope was fragile, like a piece of glass I clung to, even as it cut into my hands. Then came the night before I went into labor. I was sitting alone in the living room, rubbing my swollen belly, feeling the baby kick inside me. I remember feeling a wave of anxiety, a strange, almost primal fear. I wanted him there. I wanted him to hold my hand, to tell me everything would be okay, to tell me that he was ready to be a father, ready to be my partner. So I called him, hoping just this once that he'd come home. But he didn't pick up. The call went to voicemail, and I could hear his voice in the recording, cheerful and upbeat, as if he were talking to anyone but his wife, anyone but the woman who'd stood by him, sacrificed for him, believed in him. I left a message, my voice trembling, telling him I thought something might be happening, that I needed him to come home, that I didn't want to do this alone. I waited, heart pounding, each minute feeling like an eternity, but he never called back. He never even texted. And as the hours passed, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for so long. He didn't care. Not about me, not about our child, not about the life we'd built together. He was gone, even if he hadn't left physically. His heart, his loyalty, his commitment, they were with someone else. Someone he'd never let go of. Someone who would always come before me. And as that realization settled into my heart, I felt a numbness take over. I felt the love I'd once had for him begin to fade, replaced by something colder, something harder. I knew then that I was alone, that I'd always been alone, even when he was right there beside me. I knew that, no matter what happened, I couldn't rely on him, couldn't trust him, couldn't believe in him anymore. When the labor pains started early the next morning, I didn't even bother calling him. I knew he wouldn't answer. I knew he'd be somewhere else, doing something else with someone else. So I packed my bag in silence, breathing through the pain, holding on to the strength I'd built over months of loneliness and betrayal. I called a cab, clutching my belly, breathing through each wave of pain, telling myself that I could do this, that I didn't need him, that I'd never needed him. As I rode to the hospital alone, I looked out the window, watching the city blur by, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I was doing this by myself, and it was terrifying. But there was a part of me that felt stronger than I'd ever been. I was about to bring a life into this world, a life that was mine, that he could never take away. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself, a promise that no matter what happened, I'd be there for my child. I'd be the parent they could rely on, the one who would never leave, never abandon, never betray. And as the contractions grew stronger, as the pain intensified, I held on to that promise, clinging to it like a lifeline, because I knew, deep down, that it was all I had. All we had. As I lay there, in that sterile hospital room, clutching my newborn daughter against my chest, a strange calm washed over me. I could hear her tiny breaths, feel the warmth of her body against mine, and in that moment, something within me shifted. A strength I never knew I had rose up, filling the empty spaces that his love had left behind. For so long, I'd defined myself by what he thought of me, by the attention he gave or withheld. But lying there, with my daughter cradled in my arms, I knew I couldn't live like that anymore. This little life in my arms, this beautiful, fragile being, she needed me. Not just to survive, but to truly live, to grow up knowing her worth, to never feel the loneliness that had haunted me for so long. And in that moment, I realized that the only way I could give her that was by breaking free from the cycle I'd allowed myself to fall into. I couldn't keep waiting for a man who didn't see me, who didn't value me, who didn't even care enough to be there in my final, most vulnerable moments. The contractions, the pain, the tears I'd shed, all of it felt like a baptism, a cleansing, as if the hurt was burning away the last remnants of the love I'd held on to, leaving only a raw, unbreakable will to survive. I'd come to the hospital expecting to find him there, to see him waiting, but he was nowhere to be found. And yet, as I lay there, I felt stronger than ever. I didn't need him. I'd proven that to myself by surviving all the moments he'd left me alone, by facing every fear, every doubt without him by my side. In those quiet hours after she was born, as I watched her sleep in my arms, I made a promise to her and to myself. I promised that I would give her everything I had, that I would love her fiercely, protect her with every ounce of strength in me. And I promised that I'd never let myself be diminished again. Never let myself be someone else's afterthought. I would be enough for her and for myself. I looked down at her tiny fingers curled around mine, and I realized that she had given me the courage to start over. She'd given me a reason to let go of the past, to move forward with a strength that was entirely my own. I'd been clinging to the hope that he would change, that he'd finally see my worth, but I didn't need his validation anymore. I was done waiting for him to choose me. From that moment on, I knew that my love, my time, my energy would go into building a life for us, a life filled with love, safety, and respect. I wouldn't let his betrayal define me, wouldn't let his absence break me. I'd been holding on to a ghost, a dream of a man who never really existed. But now, with her by my side, I saw things clearly. I saw that I was enough. When the nurse came in to check on me, she gave me a gentle smile, one of those sympathetic looks that told me she knew. She could see the loneliness in my eyes, could sense the story hidden in the lines of my tired face. She congratulated me on my beautiful daughter, and as she left, she whispered, "You're stronger than you think." Those words lingered with me, echoing in my mind as I held my daughter close, whispering my promises to her. I knew that leaving him wouldn't be easy, that walking away from the life we'd built would come with its own set of challenges. But for the first time, I felt ready to face the unknown, to step into a future that I would shape with my own hands. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was determined to live. As I lay there, watching the early morning light creep in through the window, illuminating the soft features of my sleeping daughter, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It was as if the weight I'd carried for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a new clarity, a new purpose. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I'd face it on my terms, without fear, without regret. I closed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion seep into my bones, but this time, it wasn't the exhaustion of fighting for someone else's love. It was the calm, peaceful exhaustion of a battle won, a battle within myself. I had found my strength, my resilience, in the quiet moments of solitude, in the unwavering love I felt for the child in my arms. And as the sun rose, filling the room with a warm, gentle glow, I realized that I had everything I needed. I was no longer bound by his choices, no longer held captive by his neglect. I was free, finally free to be the mother, the woman, the person I was meant to be. And I knew, deep down, that I'd never look back. Hours passed before he finally showed up. I'd spent the entire night alone with our daughter, holding her, whispering promises to her, feeling the quiet strength within me grow. I was no longer waiting for him. no longer hoping for an apology or a sign of regret. I had already let go of those expectations. I was ready to face him, not as the wife who needed his love, but as the woman who had found her worth. When he walked into the hospital room, he looked disheveled, his hair tousled, his shirt rumpled as if he'd thrown it on hastily. He wore an expression of guilt mixed with irritation, as though he was the one inconvenienced by being here. It was almost laughable, really, how his presence felt like such an intrusion now, a disruption to the peace I'd found in his absence. He glanced at our daughter, barely taking in the miracle of her, his gaze flickering over her with disinterest before settling on me. "I got here as soon as I could," he said, a defensive edge in his voice, as if he expected me to commend him for showing up at all. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw him for who he truly was. Not the man I had once loved, but a stranger. Someone who was incapable of seeing beyond himself, who couldn't appreciate the life we'd created, the sacrifices I'd made, or the love I'd poured into this marriage. And as I looked at him, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing. Just a quiet indifference that told me I was ready to move on. "You missed everything," I said softly, my voice steady and calm. I could see a flash of discomfort in his eyes, a brief moment of vulnerability. But he quickly masked it with a shrug, muttering something about how he'd been busy and didn't think it was such a big deal. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Busy. As if bringing a life into this world was some minor inconvenience. As if his presence, his support, his love wasn't something he owed to his own child. But I didn't argue, didn't try to explain. I was done explaining, done hoping he would understand. "I don't need you," I said, each word deliberate, each word a release. "Not anymore. You've made your choice, over and over again, and I finally see that. I can't keep waiting for you to become the man I thought you were. I have a daughter now, and she deserves better than this, better than you." The look on his face was almost comical, a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride, as if he couldn't fathom that I would dare speak to him this way. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to defend himself, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't need your excuses," I continued. "I've spent too long listening to them, waiting for them to mean something. But they don't. They're empty, just like the promises you made, the love you pretended to give. I see that now, and I'm done pretending." He tried to step closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm, as if that small gesture could undo all the hurt, all the loneliness. But I pulled back, a boundary set in stone. "You don't get to walk back into my life just because it's convenient for you," I told him. "You made your choice, and I've made mine. I'm choosing my daughter, I'm choosing myself, and I'm choosing a life without you." The weight of those words, spoken aloud, felt like a release, a final severing of the chains that had bound me to him for so long. I didn't need his validation, his approval, his love. I was free, standing on my own, with a strength that came from within. He looked at me, perhaps searching for a hint of the woman who once loved him, who would have done anything to make him stay. But she was gone, transformed into someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, who had found love in the eyes of her child. A love that didn't require anything from him. "You'll regret this," he murmured, bitterness creeping into his voice, as if he thought he still held some power over me, as if his words could still reach the part of me that cared. But they couldn't. They only echoed in the empty space he'd left behind, a space I'd filled with self-respect and peace. "I already regret ever believing in you," I replied, my voice calm, steady. "But I don't regret this. I don't regret choosing myself, and I certainly don't regret choosing my daughter over a man who never chose me." With that, I turned away from him, my heart steady, my resolve unwavering. For the first time in my life, I was choosing me. I was choosing the life I wanted, the life I deserved, free from his shadows, his lies, his broken promises. He stood there, stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe he finally understood that he had lost me, that he had let go of the one person who would have given him everything. But it was too late. I was done waiting for him to realize my worth. As I walked away, holding my daughter close, I felt a surge of pride, a sense of liberation that filled me with a new kind of strength. I had broken free, not just from him, but from the illusions I'd clung to, the hope that had kept me bound to a love that was never real. And in that moment, I knew I was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to build a life on my own terms. Ready to raise my daughter in a world where she would know her worth, where she would never feel the need to wait for someone to love her the way she deserved. I walked out of that hospital room with my head held high, my heart free of the weight I'd carried for so long. I was no longer bound by his choices, his neglect, his betrayal. I was free to live, to love, to be everything I needed to be, for myself and for my child. And as I stepped into the morning light, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never look back. As I left the hospital, cradling my daughter in my arms, a sense of peace settled over me. Like the calm after a storm, I had walked away from the life I'd once thought was everything. From a man I had given my heart to, from dreams that no longer held meaning. But I wasn't empty. In fact, I was fuller than I'd ever been, filled with love, with strength, and with a quiet resolve to build something new, something that would be ours alone. We returned to the apartment I had once thought of as our home. But now, it felt like just another stop on my journey, a temporary space that held echoes of a life I was ready to leave behind. I looked around, at the traces of him still lingering. The suit jacket he'd left on the back of a chair, the shoes tossed carelessly by the door, reminders of the person who'd once taken up so much space in my life. I took a deep breath, and then, with purpose, I began to clear it all out. Piece by piece, I gathered his things, packing them away, freeing myself from the memories tied to every object. It was more than just clearing space, it was a symbolic release, a letting go of all the weight I had carried, of all the times I had sacrificed, all the tears I had shed. I was making room for something new, something free of his shadow. With each box I filled, a sense of freedom grew inside me. It was as if I was reclaiming myself, piece by piece. I no longer felt the need to keep parts of him around, no longer needed those reminders of a love that had never truly existed. This was my space now, mine and my daughter's. And in that space, I would create a world filled with love, warmth, and the kind of security I had always longed for. As the days passed, I found a new rhythm, one that centered around my daughter and the little life we were building together. I began to see the world through her eyes, each day an adventure, each moment a chance to make memories that were just ours. I watched her grow, held her close, sang to her as she drifted to sleep, whispering promises that I would always keep. I was her anchor, her safe harbor, the person who would always be there, no matter what. With every laugh, every sleepless night, every small milestone, I felt myself healing. The scars left by his betrayal, by the years of neglect, began to fade, replaced by a quiet joy, a sense of purpose I had never known. I didn't need him or anyone to define my happiness. I was enough, more than enough. I decided to move, to leave the apartment that held too many memories, too many reminders of a life I no longer wanted. I found a small place on the outskirts of the city, a cozy home with a garden where my daughter could grow up surrounded by light and warmth, untainted by the shadows of the past. It was a fresh start, a new beginning, a place where we could be free. As we settled into our new home, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known was possible. The weight of my past no longer hung over me. It was simply a chapter I had closed, a story I had outgrown. Here in this new place, I was creating a life that was wholly mine, one that reflected the strength I had found, the love I had cultivated, and the peace I had finally earned. I found myself laughing more, rediscovering the things I had once loved, the passions I had set aside. I'd picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years, letting colors flow onto the canvas, creating something vibrant, something alive. It was my own little form of therapy, a reminder that I still had dreams, that I still had a future waiting for me. There were quiet evenings when I would sit on the porch, my daughter nestled in my arms, watching the sunset paint the sky with colors that felt like a promise that life would go on, that there was beauty to be found, even after so much heartache. I looked down at her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and felt a sense of gratitude I could hardly put into words. She had saved me, in ways I hadn't realized. She had given me a reason to let go, a reason to start over. Every so often, I would catch myself thinking about him, wondering if he ever regretted his choices, if he ever thought about what he'd lost. But the thought would pass quickly, like a breeze that barely stirred the air. I didn't need answers, didn't need closure. I had found my own closure, my own peace. I was no longer defined by his absence, no longer haunted by what could have been. Instead, I focused on what was, on the life I was building, on the love I was nurturing, on the strength I had found within myself. I had learned to trust in my own resilience, to believe in my own worth, and that was more valuable than anything he could have ever given me. One evening, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes and asked, "Mommy, are you happy?" I felt a lump rise in my throat, a wave of emotion I hadn't expected. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered, "Yes, my love. I'm very happy." And for the first time I realized that it was true. I was happy, not in the way I had once thought happiness should look, tied to someone else's love or approval, but in a way that was entirely my own. I was happy in my independence, in my strength, in the life I was creating, one filled with love, peace, and the kind of joy that comes from truly knowing oneself. As I kissed her goodnight and turned off the light, I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her drift off to sleep. The room was filled with a soft, warm glow, a symbol of the peace that had finally settled into my heart. I knew there would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt, but I also knew that I had everything I needed to face them. This was my new beginning, a life rebuilt from the ashes of the past, a life filled with hope and the promise of something beautiful. And as I closed the door, leaving my daughter to her dreams, I felt a quiet, steady contentment settle over me. I was free. Free to live, to love, to be the mother I had always wanted to be. And as I looked forward into the future, I knew that the best was yet to come. Months passed, each one filled with moments I would treasure forever. I watched my daughter grow, each day bringing something new, a smile, a laugh, the first few words she babbled. Every little moment felt like a gift, a reminder of the strength I'd found, of the life we'd built together. It was simple, but it was enough. It was more than enough. There were days when the past felt like a distant memory, a story that belonged to someone else. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, they were no longer chains around my heart. They were lessons, reminders of what I had overcome, of the woman I had become because of them. And as time went on, I found myself feeling grateful, not for the hurt but for the strength it had given me, for the clarity I had found through it all. One quiet afternoon, as my daughter napped, I sat by the window, looking out at the garden blooming in the early spring. The colors were vibrant, alive, like a promise of new beginnings, of life constantly renewing itself. I closed my eyes and breathed in the peace that surrounded me, feeling it settle deep within me, a steady calm that I knew would always be there. In those moments of stillness, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, to this place of peace and fulfillment. I thought about the girl I had once been, the one who had waited, who had hoped, who had believed in someone who couldn't see her worth. She felt so far away now, a version of myself that I had outgrown, left behind. I felt a kind of gentle compassion for her, a tenderness for the person I had once been. She had done her best, given her all, even when it wasn't enough, but I wasn't her anymore. I was stronger now, wiser, anchored in a love that came from within. I had learned to stand on my own, to embrace my independence, to fill my life with meaning that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. I had found a love that was steady and unwavering, one that grew from the depths of my own heart. And as I looked down at my daughter, her tiny hand resting in mine, I knew that this was all I needed. Every so often, people from my past would reach out, ask me how I was doing, if I ever thought about him, about what had happened. They'd wonder if I felt any bitterness, any lingering regret. But I would simply smile, because they didn't understand. They couldn't see the freedom I had found, the joy that filled my life now, a joy that was untouched by the past. I had made peace with what was, with the choices that had led me here. I had let go of the hurt, of the dreams I'd once clung to, and I had found something better, something real. I was living a life that was honest, a life that reflected my true self, my values, my love for my daughter, and the strength I had uncovered in the quiet of my heart. As the months turned into years, I watched my daughter grow, her laughter filling our home, her spirit bright and joyful. She would look up at me with those curious eyes, asking questions, exploring the world around her, and I would feel a pride that was almost overwhelming. I was raising her to know her worth, to understand that love was not about sacrifice or suffering, but about joy, about respect, about being seen for who you truly are. And in raising her, I had healed parts of myself, parts I hadn't even known were broken. I had become the mother, the woman, the person I had always wanted to be. I was no longer waiting for someone to complete me, no longer searching for validation in someone else's eyes. I was whole, complete, and it was a feeling unlike anything I had ever known. One evening, as we sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, my daughter looked up at me and said, "Mommy, you're the best." Her words were simple, spoken with the innocence of a child, but they filled me with a happiness so pure, so profound, that I felt my heart swell with gratitude. In that moment, I knew that I had everything I needed. I had found a love that would never leave, a strength that would never fade, a peace that was unshakable. I had let go of the past, of the pain, of the need for anyone else to define my worth. I was free, free to live, to love, to be the mother and the woman I was always meant to be. As I held my daughter close, feeling her warmth, her love, I whispered a promise to her and to myself. We're going to be okay. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to live a life filled with love, with laughter, with everything that truly matters. And as the stars appeared in the sky, twinkling softly above us, I felt a sense of closure, of completion. I had found my way through the darkness, had come out the other side stronger, whole, unbreakable. This was my life now, a life of peace, of independence, of love. And as I looked forward into the future, I knew that I would never look back.